President, this is not a new issue. This has been before this body on several occasions, and I want to assure my colleagues that if the lobbyists for the pharmaceutical companies in this town are able to block this, we will be revisiting this issue. This is an issue of fundamental fairness and decency and giving Americans the opportunity to have access to the very important medication that in many cases is life-saving. Has been blocked by one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, and that is the pharmaceutical companies. For years, along with many other senators and the current occupant of the White House, the President of the United States, when he was a United States Senator, supported this amendment. I'd love to see the administration weigh in and take the same position that then Senator Obama took on this issue of basic and fundamental decency and fairness to people who are badly in need of medicine to, in many cases, literally save their lives. The industry opponents of the comprehensive importation proposals have found various ways to confuse the issue, raise red herrings about safety, or cut secret deals to block passage of reasonable and widely supported prescription drug importation programs. Let me just give you an example that's recently came up about the activities of the pharmaceutical companies in the formulation of Obamacare. And as I quote from, quote, GOP probe uncovers deal between Obama and drug companies by Philip Klein, the senior editorial writer of the Washington Examiner. Goes on, and I quote, 3 years ago, President Obama cut a secret deal with pharmaceutical company lobbyists to secure the industry's support for his national health care law. Despite Obama's promises during his campaign to run a transparent administration, the deal has been shrouded in mystery ever since. But internal emails obtained by House Republicans now provide evidence that a deal was struck, and GOP investigators are promising to release more details in the coming weeks. Quote, what the hell, unquote. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Jim Messina, who is now Obama's campaign manager, complained to a lobbyist for the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, known as PhRMA, on January 15, 2010, email, quote, this wasn't part of our deal, unquote. In reference to our deal, came 2 months before the final passage of Obamacare in an email with the subject line, quote, Tauzan email. At the time, Billy Tauzan was president and CEO of PhRMA. I might add, one of the highest paid lobbyists in history, millions of dollars. The email was uncovered as part of investigation into Obama's closed-door health care negotiations that was launched by the House Energy and Commerce Committee's oversight panel. Quote, in the coming weeks, the committee intends to show that the White House agreed to do as part of its deal with the pharmaceutical industry and how the full details of this agreement were kept from both the public and the House of Representatives, the committee's Republican members wrote in a memo today. On June 20th, 2009, Obama released a terse 296-word statement announcing a deal between pharmaceutical companies and the Senate that didn't mention any involvement by the White House. Quote, the investigation has determined that the White House, primarily through Office of Health Reform Director Nancy Ann DePerle and Messina, with involvement from Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, was actively engaged in these negotiations while the role of Congress was limited. The committee members wrote, quote, for example, 3 days before the June 20th statement, the head of PhRMA, that's Mr. Tauzan, promised Messina, quote, we will deliver a final yes to you by morning. Meanwhile, Ms. DeParlo all but confirmed that half the legislative branch was shut out in an email to PhRMA representatives, quote, I think we should have included the House in the discussions, but maybe we never would have gotten anywhere if we had tried. You know, what went on in the formulation of Obamacare is still one of the worst, sleaziest exercises that I have seen in my many years here, and this involvement by the pharmaceutical companies was probably the most egregious. All this amendment does It allows U.S. consumers who need more affordable prescription drug options either to go without their medications or pay higher prices than they could get from legitimate Canadian pharmacies. But that's not a reason. There's not a reason for us to stop fighting for those in the United States who need more affordable prescription medications. There are Americans in this country today who cannot afford their medications. They have a choice between eating or taking their prescription drugs. Meanwhile, there is a way for them to get much cheaper drugs, and this amendment does that. And you'll hear them from the pharmaceutical company supporters here in the Senate who will talk about safety, and Canadians don't have the same standards that we do. Really? Do we really believe that the Canadian regulations and oversight are any better or worse than the United States? To ensure that U.S. patients have at least one option, this amendment takes a very narrow approach to safe importation by focusing on legitimate Canadian pharmacies. Under this amendment, the Secretary of Health and Human Services will certify, quote, approved Canadian pharmacies based on certain safety and quality criteria to ensure that patients are not exposed to unsafe medications. Approved Canadian pharmacies can only sell drugs to U.S. customers that are the same as U.S. approved drugs. To protect U.S. patients against rogue distributors, a list of approved Canadian pharmacies must be published by the Secretary of Health and Human Services so Americans know which Canadian pharmacies are legitimate. The cost of health care, including prescription drugs, continues to increase. However, there's nothing in the underlying FDA bill that will bring down the cost of prescription drugs. I wonder if the bill should be enacted when it doesn't do anything to address costs. The quality of pharmaceuticals in this country is outstanding, and I recognize that. But don't we all know how expensive it is? Don't we know that, for example, that in the United States of America, Nexium, 20 milligram, 30 tabs, $195.99. The Canadian brand, $108.55. Canadian generic, $69. Plavix, U.S. brand, $195. Canada brand, $132. I am sure that many Americans whose health coverage does not include these very expensive pharmaceuticals would be eager to take advantage of the same quality brand of prescription drugs that's available at these pharmacies in Canada. Unemployment remains over 8%, as we all know. Millions of families have mothers and fathers who remain unemployed or underemployed and have no health insurance coverage. But the unemployed and uninsured still have health conditions, and they need medications. And millions continue searching for more affordable ways to get their needed prescription drugs. Unfortunately, in my state, many of my fellow citizens who can't afford it go to Mexico and get drugs there, and I can't guarantee what they purchase there will always be what it's purported to be. And that is not a criticism of my friends south of the border. But the fact is that in Canada, they have the same kind of process that we do. Well, millions continue searching for more. Despite there being no official program to import medications from Canada, approximately 1 million U.S. consumers use their own money to safely get their medications from legitimate Canadian pharmacies. In Arizona, over 20,000 patients purchase their medications safely from Canadian pharmacies. In Florida, over 85,000 patients purchase their medications safely from Canadian pharmacies. A recent study from Roger Bate, an AEI scholar, confirms that in drugs dispensed from legitimate Canadian pharmacies, there was no failure of authenticity between drug samples obtained online from U.S. pharmacies compared to the same drug from Canadian pharmacies. And within the verified pharmacies, U.S. prices on average were 52.5% higher than Canadian pharmacy prices. In other words, the drugs from Canadian pharmacy sites are the same dosage, form, and potency as drugs in the U.S., only much less expensive. The drugs are the same as I mentioned. This amendment doesn't authorize insurance companies, huge pharmacy chains, or drug wholesalers to import massive quantities into the U.S. system. This is about safely allowing uninsured, unemployed, or the underemployed to individually import these drugs that they need. So please, somebody explain to me how we tell the struggling family who needs their medications that they can't use their own money to get the same drug from legitimate Canadian pharmacies where the cost can be more than 50% lower than U.S. prices. It's not about the alarms of safety, because this amendment requires the Secretary of Health and Human Services to promulgate regulations permitting individuals to safely import medications from Canada, and the following safety criteria must be met for a patient to import drugs from FDA-approved Canadian pharmacies. The prescribed drug must be dispensed by a licensed Canadian pharmacist. The prescribed drug must be for personal use in quantities that don't exceed a 90-day supply. The prescribed drug must be dispensed in accordance with a valid prescription issued by a physician licensed to practice in the U.S. The imported drug must have, quote, the same active ingredient or ingredients, route of administration, dosage form, and strength as a prescription drug approved by the Secretary. The amendment recognizes that approved Canadian pharmacies meeting safety criteria can and should provide needed alternatives to U.S. patients using their own money to affordably obtain their medications. The Secretary is required to publish on the FDA website a list of approved Canadian pharmacies that meet the following stringent criteria. Pharmacy has been in existence for 5 years prior to enactment of the program and has a purpose other than to participate in the U.S.-Canadian Safe Drug Importation Program. The pharmacy operates in accordance with provincial pharmacy rules and regulations. The pharmacy complies with all inspection and data reporting procedures. The pharmacy agrees that labs approved by the Secretary shall be used to conduct product testing to determine the safety and efficacy of sampled pharmaceutical products. The pharmacy does not resell products from online pharmacies located outside Canada to consumers in the U.S. Safe drug importation is a bipartisan issue. People in all of our states are still struggling with family budgets, and the U.S. Senate can't do anything to give patients more choices about where they can get their needed drugs because the drug industry opposes allowing individual Americans to use their own money to safely get the same drugs from Canada. It doesn't make sense. Just a word about the types of medications that are eligible. I've been asked by colleagues whether biologic medicines can be part of the program. The answer is not unless they can be safely imported under the provisions of the amendment and regulations issued by the Secretary. The amendment doesn't discriminate against the type of conditions or medicines that patients should be able to safely import under this program. Not all biologics are the same. Some biologic medicines are available in capsules, others injectable medications that require refrigeration. Some injectables don't require refrigeration and are shipped to patients throughout the U.S. every day. A one-size-fits-all approach does not work here. And I don't believe that U.S. patients should necessarily be prevented from saving money on biologics. If a biologic medicine can't meet the various safety provisions in the amendment, then it should not be eligible. But if it can meet the requirements of the amendment, then a biologic can be available to U.S. patients. Mr. President, if the past is a prologue, then obviously this amendment will go down. And then after this amendment is rejected, I hope that none of my colleagues have any curiosity about the way the American people feel about us, about the incredible, inordinate, illegitimate outrageous influence of the pharmaceutical companies in America over the average American citizen. American citizens should be able to purchase pharmaceuticals from an approved pharmacy in Canada that in many times are saving them half the money. I'm sure that the distinguished chairman, my friend from Iowa, knows how many families do not have prescription drug coverage, that are making a choice today between eating and medicine. And what are we going to do? We're going to turn down this common sense amendment. Congratulations ahead of time to the corrupt pharmaceutical companies and their influence here in the United States Senate and the Capitol. Mr. President, I ask for yeas and nays on the amendment.